Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and this is the second installment in my Cromwellathon videos. So some of you are participating in this with me, and so essentially what we're doing is we are reading Wolf Hall together in January, Bring Up the Bodies together in February, in preparation for the publication of the third and final novel in Hilary Mantel's Cromwell series, The Mirror and the Light, which comes out, I believe, March 5th in England and March 10th in the US and in Canada. I'm not sure about other countries. If you're making videos in this series, be sure to use the hashtag so that way I can find them easily. And I'm putting together a playlist of the videos in the Cromwellathon project. But today, we're going to be covering the chapters An Occult History of Britain, Make or Mar All Hallows, and Three-Card Trick. And as you guys know from my previous video, this is my third time reading Wolf Hall. So basically, I'm just going to be giving you my impressions, maybe a little bit of analysis, but mainly just my impressions of reading the book for the third time. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is on page 80 in my edition. So here's a passage that I just wanted to read you real quick and then talk about briefly. 6 times, to the world's knowledge, Catherine and the king have lived in hope of an heir. I remember the winter child, Wolsey says. I suppose, Thomas, you would not be back in England then. The queen was taken unexpectedly with pains, and the prince was born early, just at the turn of the year. When he was less than an hour old, I held him in my arms, the sleet falling outside the windows, the chamber alive with firelight, the dark coming down by 3 o'clock, and the tracks of birds and beasts covered that night by the snow. Every mark of the old world wiped out, and all our pain abolished. We called him the New Year's Prince. We said he would be the richest, the most beautiful, the most devoted. The whole of London was lit up in celebration. He breathed 52 days, and I counted every one of them. And what strikes me about that passage, apart from the absolutely beautiful prose, is this notion of the snow making things new, right? So what's that line again? And the tracks of birds and beasts covered that night by the snow, every mark of the old world wiped out, and all our pain abolished. The snow making a kind of tabula rasa of England, of the state, really. And it seems to me, I mean, when I think about this, that Wolf Hall is full of these kind of clean slates, right? So I've got my notes here. I'm going to be referring to these throughout. Cromwell has created himself, right? He left home at the age of 14 or 15, and he made himself into something new and into something mysterious. His past was that tabula rasa, right? It was that snow-covered plain on which he fashioned a new version of himself. He resituated, he repositioned his family name. He gave it a kind of dignity that it hadn't had before. And then we have Henry's attempt to clean slate his marriage to Catherine, to start completely fresh, pretend like it never happened. And then there are the rumblings of Protestantism in the book, right? This idea of taking the established church, right, the Catholic Church, the thing that had been in place for more than a millennium, and making something fresh from it, right, with new interpretations of the Gospels and new ways of thinking about one's relationship to God, one's relationship to the afterlife. Throughout the book, there are these, we get to kind of eavesdrop on Thomas Cromwell's thoughts, and he's like, where in the Gospels does it say this? Where in the Gospels does it say that? Where in the Gospels does it say purgatory, for instance? So throughout, there are these kind of clean slates, blank canvases throughout this book. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is just a couple of pages later, and that is just an example of Hilary Mantel's absolutely brilliant characterization, the way that she can paint a portrait of a character with just 2 or 3 sentences that tells you so much information about the heart and the will and the personality of that person. And here she is talking about Anne Cromwell. Okay, so this is Thomas Cromwell's oldest daughter. Anne Cromwell is a tough little girl. She could eat a princess for breakfast. Like St. Paul's God, she is no respecter of persons, and her eyes, small and steady as her father's, fall coldly on those who cross her. The family joke is what London will be like when our Anne becomes Lord Mayor. And then, very next sentence, right, she's going on to talk about Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor is a pale, clever doll with fox-colored hair who speaks with more gravity than the average bishop. She was barely 10 years old when her father sent her to Ludlow to hold court as Princess of Wales. How clearly is Hilary Mantel etching these people in just a handful of words, right? It's wonderful. It's just wonderful to see. And it doesn't get old, right? It's refreshing. It's startling. Every time I read this book, I happen upon passages that maybe I had forgotten about or what have you. And they just take my breath away anew. And that's a wonderful thing, man. I wish every book did that. Not every book does. And then, just 2 pages after that, just another example of Hilary Mantel's peerless prose. Is a woman bound to wifely obedience when the result will be to turn her out of the estate of wife? He, Cromwell, admires Catherine. He likes to see her moving about the royal palaces, as wide as she is high, stitched into gowns so bristling with gemstones that they look as if they are designed less for beauty than to withstand blows from a sword. Her auburn hair is faded and streaked with gray, tucked back under her gable hood like the modest wings of a city sparrow. So again, you can see Catherine, right? She paints her so clearly. And again, it's not her personality in this case, it's her wardrobe. But that description, gowns so bristling with gemstones that they look as if they are designed less for beauty than to withstand blows from a sword. It's so visual, right? Later in the reading for today, she describes Henry as being so brightly colored, right? She describes him as being like a king in a new pack of cards, which is it's just wonderful, right? Like I marvel at an imagination that that thinks that way, an imagination in which such descriptions occur. It's just a wonderful thing. A little later here, about 10 pages, we have 2 of the best pages of writing in this book, and they start here, right? Wolsey sits with his elbows on his desk, his fingers dabbing his closed lids. He takes a great breath and begins to talk. He begins to talk about England. So I won't read the full 2 pages, but what Hilary Mantel is doing here, right, in the voice of Cardinal Wolsey, is she is framing England as a land of myth and as a land of kind of nightmarish upheaval. She's establishing England as a land of folklore, right? And not just a land of folklore, but a line of folklore. She's reminding us that at that time, and for centuries prior, England had been a place where superstition informed identity, and it informed politics, and it informed memory. And this section right here, right, this story that Wolsey is telling Cromwell is breathtaking to me. And just a few pages after that, we have this. Next morning when he wakes, Liz is still sleeping. The sheets are damp. She is warm and flushed, her face smooth like a young girl's. He kisses her hairline. She tastes of salt. She murmurs, "Tell me when you are coming home." Right, but those sentences, she is warm and flushed, right? She tastes of salt. She is feverish. Thomas doesn't necessarily realize this. He doesn't know. He doesn't know to be afraid of what it portends. She will be dead by the time he returns home that afternoon. That's how quickly this illness moves. And she doesn't even seem to realize that she's sick at this point, right? She's just wanting to know when he's going to be back. thinking mistakenly that he's going to be going with Wolsey. And that passage led me to start looking at the book as a kind of study in premonitions or signs, and how skilled we as individuals and as societies might or might not be in reading those premonitions or signs. It's just salt. It's just a taste of salt, but it points to something so tragic and so dark, and Thomas didn't see that. Cromwell doesn't see it, and he's never going to forget that, right? He's never going to forget that. He's going to live with that regret forever. If we flip back 30 pages or so, we see another example of this, where there are signs, right, pointing to an eventual outcome, and what happens when we fail to read those? What happens when the characters fail to see what they mean? He had his heart set on Lady Anne, but the cardinal married him to Mary Talbot, and now they're as miserable as dawn on Ash Wednesday. And the Lady Anne said, well, we all laughed at the time. She said that if she could work my Lord Cardinal any displeasure, she would do it. Can you think how we laughed? Some sallow chit, forgive me, a knight's daughter, to menace my Lord Cardinal, her nose out of joint because she could not have an earl, but we could not know how she would rise and rise. So again, right, it's a question of underestimating a character, underestimating just how a nose being out of joint can affect a person. And on page 150 in my edition, we have what are the two most beautiful pages, the most moving pages of prose, I think, not only in this book, but between the first two books in the Cromwell series. And again, I'm not going to read these, but there are times when I can't even think about this scene, right? It's the scene of Cromwell's daughters, right? Anne and Grace dying from the sweating sickness, from the plague. And yeah, there are times where I can't even think about this without getting choked up. There are times where I can't talk about it with people without getting choked up. And I just think it's breathtaking, right? I was exchanging messages with Laura Wicello on Facebook the other night about this section, and she talked about the economy of language in this section, and how Hilary Mantel doesn't put a word out of place, right? Everything is very clean, it's very simple, it's very elegant, and it's so perfect. Like, these two pages are just absolutely perfect. My favorite sentence in this section is so Thomas Cromwell is speaking to his mother-in-law, I believe it is, and he's talking about Anne, his eldest daughter, who has just died. And his mother-in-law says, she was clever and good, and in her way, she was beautiful. His thought had been, she was learning Greek. Perhaps she knows it now. And I love that. Oh, I got goosebumps reading it. I love that so much, for so many different reasons, right? That the word perhaps she knows it now. Thomas Cromwell isn't, even in his own thoughts, in his own heart, he's not absolutely certain of anything. He believes, but he's not absolutely certain, right? He still lives in a kind of hope for what might be awaiting his daughters after their deaths. Further down that page, at the very end of this section I love so much, he wonders again if the dead need translators. Perhaps in a moment, in the simple twist of unbecoming, they know everything they need to know. And I just love that phrase, a simple twist of unbecoming, right? That hinge, the idea that death is a pivot, right, in existence. It's not an end. It's a pivot into not even an awakening necessarily, right? Because that implies something gradual, I suppose. But a pivot from knowing what we know to being immersed in all knowledge and knowing everything in a moment. When mine and Kelly's friend Vernon died about 10 years ago, he was halfway through reading Anna Karenina for the first time. And I really like the idea I really like thinking that in the moment when Vernon died, he knew the rest of the book without having had to read it. He knew it maybe from, finding himself in the presence of Tolstoy's mind, of Tolstoy's spirit, sharing that same space with him, being part of the mind that created Anna Karenina, alongside Tolstoy in whatever heaven is. I really love that idea. But I find this so moving. It's difficult to talk about, so I'm just going to leave it there. Then about 15 pages after that, there was a sentence that I found myself almost racing past, actually. I think it would be really easy to just kind of cruise past this sentence without really thinking about what it implies. And it says here, "The House sits late, and before I leave Westminster, I have to gather up the letters and petitions to my Lord Cardinal and talk with all the people who want to send messages but don't want them put into writing." So what does that mean, right? So that, it seems to me, to point to a world in which people are fretful, a world in which people are paranoid, a world in which people don't know how far they can trust their allegiances, which would be terrifying, which would be a terrifying environment to live in. But yeah, I just thought it could just be a throwaway sentence, right? Just a simple thing that people don't even notice as they're kind of just tearing through the book. But I think there's just so much in that. And talk with all the people who want to send messages but don't want them put into writing, right? So that there's no evidence of them having said it. That's fabulous writing. It's so subtle. It's so subtle. And then a little bit later, we see Cromwell returning in his mind to the scene we talked about in my first video, where he took off the holy medal that Cat had given him when he left home and went out to sea. It says he touches his throat where the medal would have been, the holy medal that Cat gave him. His fingers are surprised not to find it there. For the first time, he understands why he took it off and slid it into the sea. It was so that no living hand could take it. The waves took it, and the waves have it still. Now, this seems not a refutation of my interpretation of that earlier scene in my first video, but just a kind of nice complication of it, right? This idea that, I talked before about how Cromwell wanted anything good that came his way to be the result of his own efforts, right? And not have any kind of connection to this holy medal. And here we're told that it has something to do with not wanting any man to have any kind of dominion over him, any kind of control or power over him, which goes hand in hand with what I was talking about in that first video. And then on 180, the very next page, the paragraph that starts, "When he hears this, he thinks, imagine living inside the Lord Chancellor's head. Imagine writing down such a charge," etc., etc., etc. And I marked that because in 2018, which was the 50th anniversary of the Booker Prize, they did what was called the Golden Booker Award, the Golden Booker ceremony. And one book, so each decade of the prize was assigned one judge, and that judge read all of the books that won in his or her decade and chose the best. And then those 5 best competed against each other in a public vote. And Wolf Hall was chosen the best of its decade. Its judge was Simon Mayo, right, who I think has a radio program. He has some kind of connection with the film critic Mark Kermode. I was just watching their review earlier today of 1917, which I saw earlier today, which all of you should go see. It's so much better than Little Women. But Simon Mayo was the judge of the 2000s and chose Wolf Hall as the best Booker winner of that decade. And when they released the finalists, the list of finalists, they released the Booker Prize released a series of 1-minute videos. And each one had a different judge reading a passage from the work that they chose as the best of the decade, and just talking a little bit about it. And that right there, so the passage that starts, "Imagine writing down such a charge and taking it to the printer," that's the passage that Simon Mayo reads really beautifully in his video and talks about just the genius, the brilliance of this novel. I will try to remember to link that video in the description box below. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was just how cool it was that that the chapter 3 card trick ends basically with a long conversation between Cromwell and Henry. It's the first time we really see Henry in the book. It's the first time Henry really has a voice in the book. And a long conversation between Cromwell and Thomas More at the dinner table of one of Cromwell's friends. And both the conversation between Cromwell and Henry and Cromwell and More, both of those read so much like chess games, right? Like battles of wits. At one point, Cromwell, Henry's talking to him about how people perceive Cromwell, and Cromwell says something to him, something to the effect of, what would you have me be? And we get this idea that Cromwell can be a kind of chameleon, right? That he can manipulate relationships and he can manipulate his environment in such a way that he can be anything to anyone. And that's a useful skill to have, right? That kind of chameleon thing in a world where, like I said before, people are paranoid, people are fretful, people don't know whom they can trust. And Cromwell seems to me a perfect kind of hero for a story set in a world like that. So for next week in Cromwellathon, we are going to be reading the chapters Entirely Beloved Cromwell, The Dead Complain of Their Burial, Christmastide, 1530, and the first section in part 4, which is called Arrange Your Face. I'm enjoying the hell out of myself. I hope you guys are enjoying the book too. I've really enjoyed seeing the videos that have been put up so far. Peg, the book prize addict, yesterday put up a video in which she talked not only about Wolf Hall, but about this sweater, this kind of hooded sweater thing that she's been knitting or what have you, and I thought it was wonderful. It was bright red. It was Tudor rose red, and she actually reminded me of Cardinal Wolsey in the thumbnail, and I thought that was a lot of fun. But anyway, let me know what you guys thought of the reading for today, and I will see you guys again very soon. Adios.